Let's talk about Jeffrey Epstein. And really, the whole story is just one giant question mark. I mean, how does a college dropout with no clear job end up building this massive empire? We're talking wealth and influence that reached the absolute highest levels of power on the planet. It's the central mystery, and that's what we're diving into.
And really, it all boils down to this one huge question. It's the same one investigators, journalists, all of us have been asking for years. Where in the world did all that money come from? And listen, this isn't just some small detail. It's like the key that could unlock this entire twisted story. And that right there, that's the Epstein paradox. On one hand, you've got this guy who dropped out of college. No big public company, no obvious product he's selling. But on the other hand, a lifestyle that is just insane. We're talking private jets, multiple mansions, and he's hanging out with presidents and princes. I mean, you look at both columns and it just doesn't add up.
Okay, so let's get into his rise. This wasn't some guy climbing the corporate ladder for 20 years. No, it was more like a sudden explosion into this world of extreme wealth. And the craziest part, it all happened in the shadows. Now, you've probably heard the theories, right? There are a bunch of them floating around. Some people say, oh, he was just a very discreet money manager for other billionaires. Okay, others point to this really complex web of shell companies all over the world. And then you get the really wild ones, connections to covert intelligence agencies. But here's the bottom line. Not one of those theories, on its own, has ever come close to explaining the sheer scale of his fortune. But here's the thing you have to understand about Epstein. His real currency wasn't just money. No, what was maybe even more valuable was his influence. He didn't just collect dollars, he collected powerful people. It's like his whole game was becoming this gatekeeper, and his connections were like trophies on a shelf. And make no mistake, these weren't just casual friendships. They were assets. They gave him access, they gave him protection, and they made him look legitimate. And when we say powerful, we mean powerful. His social circle was basically a who's who of the entire planet. Let's take former President Bill Clinton, for example. His name shows up again and again in the flight logs for Epstein's private jet. And this wasn't a one-party thing either. His network cut right across the political aisle. Before they had a falling out, Donald Trump was also in that circle. He even called Epstein a terrific guy at one point. And his reach went international, all the way across the Atlantic. Most famously, of course, to Britain's Prince Andrew, a connection that lit the fuse on a massive royal scandal. So it brings us back to the question, right? How does a guy with zero social background build a network like this? Well, a lot of arrows point to one person, Ghislaine Maxwell. See, she was the daughter of a British media mogul. She had the one thing Epstein didn't, a golden ticket into high society. Investigators basically call her the social architect of his entire world. She was the one who could open any door he wanted. And where did he entertain this powerful network? Well, he had a few infamous locations and toys. First, there was the private jet, which got the creepy nickname the Lolita Express, and its flight logs are famously full of holes. Then there was his private island in the Caribbean, Little St. James. Think of it less like a vacation spot and more like a fortress, heavily monitored, with that really weird dome-shaped building on it. For the longest time, it really seemed like Epstein was untouchable, like he was operating completely above the law. And then, in 2008, it looks like the system had finally caught up to him, or at least that's what we thought. What actually happened was a legal deal so ridiculously lenient it just stunned everyone and made people ask, just how much influence does this guy have? Okay, get this. The charge was soliciting a minor for prostitution. This is a serious federal crime that could have landed him in prison for life. And his sentence? About 13 months. And even then, most of that time wasn't in a regular prison, but in a private wing of a county jail. The actual terms of this deal were just unbelievable. First, federal prosecutors just dropped a potential life sentence off the table. Gone. Second, he got work release. That meant he could leave the jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week to go to his office. And here's the kicker, the most crucial part. The deal secretly gave total immunity from federal charges to anyone who might have been his co-conspirator. That kind of thing is almost unheard of. So, as you can imagine, legal experts, victims advocates, they were absolutely furious. They all started calling it a sweetheart deal. And that moment right there is what really cemented this idea in the public's mind that Epstein was just
too connected, too powerful to ever face real justice. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. Fast forward about a decade, and he gets arrested again. And this time, it felt different. It felt like, okay, this is it. The secrets are finally going to come out. But, well, the final chapter of his life just ended up creating more questions than it answered. So it's July 2019. He's arrested on federal sex trafficking charges. The entire world is watching, holding its breath for a trial that promised to blow the lid off everything, unseal documents, expose the whole network. And then, just over a month later, on August 10th, weeks before the trial, Jeffrey Epstein is found dead in his jail cell in Manhattan.
The official cause of death was ruled a suicide, but the circumstances were, let's just say, highly suspicious. First, the security cameras outside his cell, they supposedly malfunctioned. The 2 guards who were supposed to be watching his unit, they were asleep, and they later admitted to faking the records to cover it up. I mean, just think about that for a second. The single most high-profile inmate in the entire country was left totally unsupervised. Of course, that just led to a massive explosion of theories.
So his death didn't bring any closure at all. In fact, you could argue it did the opposite. It basically guaranteed that some of the biggest secrets might stay buried forever, which is why, even now, the Epstein story is nowhere near over. Because even today, there are huge pieces of this puzzle that are completely locked away from us. We have witness testimonies that are still sealed. We've never seen his full, unredacted financial records. We still don't know the complete extent of his network. And maybe most importantly, we have no idea what kind of blackmail material he might have had on people. And all of that just leaves us with this one big, unsettling question, doesn't it? With so much stuff still hidden, still sealed away, have we really seen the full truth? Do we actually know who Jeffrey Epstein really was and what he was really doing? It kind of makes you think about how power works, you know? Some people manage to get rich, and some people get powerful. But then there's this tiny, tiny group of people who seem to become something else entirely, untouchable. Until all of a sudden, they're not. And I think that's the real takeaway here. The official case file on Jeffrey Epstein might be stamped closed, but the questions, man, those questions are still wide open.